Հայօգնության միության Թորոնտոյի Ռուբինա մասնաճյուղի վարչության եւ միջազգային կանանց օրվա հանձնախումբի անունով Փարիք հալուստ կուզեմ մաղթել ցել բոլորին այս տոնակատարության։ Անունս Լուսի Ներսեսյան Լոփեզ է եւ ես Մերի Ներսեսյան Սաղարյանի, Արդա Զաքարյանի եւ Միշել Զադիկյանի հետ հաջույքն ու բադիվը ունենք այսօրվա ծեր հանդիսավարները լալու։ Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Member of Parliament for Simcoe Grey and Minister of Labour and the Minister responsible for the status of women, Dr. Kelly Leach. Toronto City Councillor Shelley Carroll, TDSB Trustee Harut Manugyan, Ms. Ani Demirjian, Mrs. Nevrig Azadian, ARS Central Representative Member Mrs. Naidi Shahinian, Regional Representative Members, and distinguished guests. I'd like to welcome you to the Armenian Relief Society Toronto Roubina Chapter's 5th annual celebration of International Women's Day. I'm proud to present to you this year's theme of Equity for Women is Progress for All. My name is Lucy Nersesyan Lopez, and I, along with fellow journalists Mary Nersesyan Sağaryan, Arda Zakarian, and Michelle Zadikian, are your masters of ceremony for this afternoon. During the course of this afternoon, we will address you both in English and Armenian. Հայօգնության միությունը հիմնվեցավ Նյու Յորքի մեջ 1910 թվին, հայ Գարմիր խաչ անվանդակ, ան ծնունդ հարավ հայ ժողովրդի ասկային եւ փարեսիրական մտահոգություններեն, ծնունդ հարավ օգնության ցերկ երգարելու հայուն ու հասնելու համար անոր գարիքներուն։ Հայօգնության միությունը հայ կյանքի մեջ ամենեն զավալուն եւ ամենեն ժողովրդական գանացի գազագերբությունն է։ Այսօր 27 երկիրներու մեջ կորձող իր միավորներով եւ դասնյակ հազար անդամներով հոմը որպես անգախ համահայկական, փարեսիրական եւ մարդասիրական միություն գծարայե ամենուրեք հասնելով հայ ժողովրդի ուսումնական, ընկերային եւ մշակութային կյանքերուն, գարիքներուն։ Հոմը իբրև միջազգային գազագերբություն մոդեն կհետևի ոչ միայն հայությունը, այլ եւ միջազգային համայնքը հուզող ընկերային եւ փարեսիրական հարցերուն ու դակնաբներուն։ Ինչպես անցյալին, այսօր եւս հոմը կշարունակե իր գրթական, տասյարակչական ու մշակութային ծրագիրները կործատրել մանկաբարձներով, ամառնային ճամփարներով, վարժարաններով ու գրթաթոշակներով։ Վերջերս հայօգնության միությունը հատուկ ուշադրություն դարձած է սուրիահայության, որոնք ենթարկված են հսկա դժվարություններու Սուրիո քաղաքացիական պատերազմի հետևանքներով։ Today's event is hosted by the Armenian Relief Society. The ARS is an independent, non-governmental organization recognized by the United Nations. ARS works to preserve the cultural identity of the Armenian nation and brings humanitarian help wherever the need arises to all communities in distress. More locally, the Toronto chapter continually sends financial and volunteer support to the Hospital for Sick Children, local food banks and nursing homes, and long-term care facilities. It's also been noted to have raised the most funds in 2009 for the Canadian Cancer Society's annual Daffodil Drive. The ARS is a strong advocate of human rights, social justice, and civil society around the world. Most recently, ARS turned its attention to the Armenians in Syria, where civil war has ravaged and displaced the civilian population. 1910 թվականին Դիգին Քլերա Զետկինի առաջարկով ծնունդ արավ Գանանց միջազգային օրվա տոնակատարությունը։ Գանանց միջազգային օրը ամեն տարի կնշվի մարտ 8-ին ու կդոնվի աշխարհին 4 կողմը։ Այս տոնը կորձակցության միջոց եղած է գանանց իրավունքները պաշտպանելու եւ քննադատելու անոնց տարած աշխատանքը։ International Women's Day is celebrated annually on March 8th as a day acknowledging and celebrating the economic, political, and social achievements of women in the past, present, and future. Born at a time of great social turbulence and crisis, International Women's Day inherited a tradition of protest and political activism. In 1910, Clara Zetkin, the leader of the Women's Office for the Social Democratic Party of Germany, proposed the idea of International Women's Day at the International Conference of Working Women in Copenhagen. International Women's Day is a time to reflect on progress made, to call for change, and to celebrate acts of courage and determination by ordinary women who have played an extraordinary role in the history of their countries and communities. At this time, I'd like to call upon Dr. Kelly Leitch. We're honored to have Dr. Leitch here with us today. She's the Member of Parliament for Simcoe Grey, the Minister responsible for the status of women, and the Minister of Labour. I'd like to invite her up to the podium to say a few words.
So I had a great opportunity to think about what I was going to talk about today and at many of the events for International Women's Week as the new Minister for Status of Women. And I was thinking to myself, who inspires me the most? Who do I want to emulate? Who is that one person that if I could be like them, I would be pleased that I had satisfied my life goals? And I encourage all of you to do exactly the same this week, International Women's Week, because for me, that's my mom. The person who has supported me through the good times, and some really bad ones too, but the person who is always there. And that's exactly what all of you are. The person who is always there, making sure, whether it's for your family, for your community, or for the world community abroad with what you're doing through the Armenian Relief Society, to make sure that your family, other Canadians, and individuals worldwide are supported. So thank you for everything you're doing. I had the good fortune to actually go to the Armenian Centre that you support here in Toronto just a few months ago. And it was outstanding. I had a wonderful visit. I learned what your community is doing, not just amongst the Armenian society here in Toronto, but for other Torontonians and for people across our province and across our country. And I particularly want to thank Harut, who is here today, one of the local councillors on the Toronto School Board, for what outstanding work he's doing, also introducing me to the community, and also to Annie, who was kind enough to be a part of my visit so that I would understand the richness of your community even better. Now, as the Minister for Status of Women, I have a number of responsibilities for International Women's Week. One of those things is making sure that there's a focal point of what we're doing as Canadians. You know, as was mentioned, we have this fabulous opportunity. And so for the Government of Canada, what we'll be focused on this week and extending throughout the entire year is a theme that we've called Strong Women, Strong Canada, Growing and Creating Jobs one business at a time. And people say to me, well, why would you pick that as a theme? You know, International Women's Week is supposed to be about equality and certain international issues. Well, we know the facts are in Canada that 1.5 million jobs are created every year by women-led businesses. It's a huge number. We know that in 2011, $148 billion was added to the Canadian economy because of female businesses, women-led enterprises. We know, and I think those of you that are entrepreneurs know, or if you're a professional, because you have independence, that the opportunity available to women to have flexibility in their lives so they can take care of their families, focus on the items in their community they care about, and also do larger projects. That flexibility of running your own business, being an entrepreneur, or being a professional creates those opportunities. And so I was delighted that in this year's budget, just a month ago, the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance announced a special initiative that will be running across the country to support women entrepreneurs, to make sure that they are a focal point, that women entering into business and women in professional careers are a focus of our government going forward for the next year. So I hope that you will participate in this venture with me. Send me the ideas that you have to make sure that we're growing our Canadian economy and creating jobs, but also supporting women to start their own business or to grow their own business or to extend their business internationally. And so I need your help to do that. Now, one of the things that was just mentioned is all of the great work that you do with the Armenian Relief Society. And I have to say I have a bit of a soft spot for one of the places that you invest your time and efforts in, which is sick kids. I'm a pediatric orthopedic surgeon by training. I have a little bit of a different day job now. But I am still practicing part-time. And I was trained at sick kids. I was there as staff for a number of years. And I have to tell you that the work that you do to support what we do at sick kids is outstanding. So thank you very much for that investment. It's greatly appreciated. I don't think many people understand that the work that organizations like you do to support what we do at sick kids, and also the international work that you're doing, how meaningful it is. I get the opportunity to know exactly that what your investments are doing. And so whether it's standing in the emergency department and knowing that the cast saw I use, albeit that you may not think that that's a really relevant thing, works properly to get the cast off the child so we can take an x-ray, is valuable. Or what you do to make sure that families are supported when they're in our institution under those really tumultuous times that they're going through, it's outstanding. And also what you're doing internationally. You know, the comments with respect to what you're doing in Syria. I, as a physician, prior to getting elected in 2011, spent a significant amount of time traveling overseas, whether it be Lebanon, Afghanistan, a number of places which are war-torn areas. What you're doing, the investments that you're making, the people that you are supporting, you are doing the things that we as Canadians, I think, are well known for, being humanitarians and making sure that we're protecting and supporting others. So once again, thank you very much for your outstanding work internationally. I have had great opportunity now. This is now the third event that I've been to for International Women's Week. As was mentioned, it culminates in International Women's Day on March the 8th. Following that, I will be traveling to New York, to the United Nations, for a number of meetings that we have as a collective world to make sure that we're pushing forward the things that are important to women. One of the things that Canada has championed, and I encourage you to start thinking about it now, is International Day of the Girl. Canada pushed forward at the United Nations this initiative 2 years ago. It continues to grow with over 126 countries now actively participating in this venture. It is a focus on making sure that young women, children, girls have access to education, have access to opportunities in healthcare, so that they can prosper, grow, maybe start their own business in their home country. But what we need to do as Canadians, and I think we have a responsibility to do, and I see that in organizations like your own where you're helping in Syria and you're helping across the globe, we have a responsibility to make sure that other young women and girls have those same opportunities in other countries. And that's what we're doing through the Canadian government. That's what I'll be doing at the UN next week. And I'd like to get your input on what I should be doing come International Day of the Girl to move that bar even further internationally in the future. So thank you very much for having me. Please put your thinking caps on. I need your ideas. And I hope you have a fabulous conference today.
Thank you. Thank you, and welcome, and thank you for your words, Minister Leach. International Women's Day makes all of us think of our moms, I think. A year ago, almost a year ago now, my mother passed away. So before I get to why I raised that point, if you brought your mother today, turn to her and say, "I'm glad you're here." Because there comes a day where that's not the case. But I'll tell you, what happens when you have that particular loss, that loss for women, you spend a full year thinking about it. Have I done what I was supposed to do? Was I a good daughter, and am I still a good daughter, and am I going to be a good daughter into the future? It just keeps entering your mind. Some call it the year of magical thinking, and it's particularly true of this particular loss. But I've been thinking about that a lot. And I'm a woman in government, as is Dr. Leach. And what happens is when you say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to run for office, because our moms were of a generation where the percentage of women in government was maybe 1 or 2%. Now it's 20 across Canada, across all the levels of government. 20 is worth applauding. 20% is worth applauding, but never lose sight of the fact that the goal is 30. The goal is 30, and we're not there yet. We are there in the Toronto Council. We're getting there across the GTA. At the municipal level of government, the woman lens on city business has an amazing impact. Having women in government means that there'll be a woman lens put on that. We'll absorb density. We'll build the buildings for you. We'll put riders on the new transit system. But hold up. Disproportionately, the riders of transit, the people who need it the most for work, are women. And the people who will live in those dense communities, because there is still a ceiling on earnings for women, it's a little more porous than it was, but it's still there, means that they're probably the women that are going to be working at the kinds of wages and salaries that they need that transit. And they'll probably live in those dense areas where they can find more affordable housing. So let's put a woman lens on the government that designs that community for them. Sure, I have to have tall buildings, but you will notice a thing that is happening now. Where you see the tall buildings going in, you will see them oftentimes wrapped with townhouses, wrapped with homes and units of housing that look out onto the street. How'd that happen? Well, it's just because you can charge more for those townhouses, so let's slap some in there. No, what has happened over time is we've begun to look at, okay, we'll put the population in here and it's growing and growing and growing, but how do we design communities so that a woman, whatever her walk of life, can get off transportation and public transit systems and walk safely home? Because if this neighborhood works for that woman, it works for everyone. It works for the 8-year-old child. It works for the 80-year-old citizen who's struggling. If you put a woman lens on things, which is very much your theme today, equity for women means equity for all. Design for women in working life and in communities and the way we build our infrastructure means that it will work for the whole family unit at any generation. And so 20 is already making that happen. 30% will make it very, very real. You can put a woman lens on the worst part of government, figuring out the finances. You can put a woman lens on the design pieces that are the most fun part of your job. But if it's there and it begins to permeate that order of government, here's the special thing that is starting to happen. It doesn't always have to just come from the woman member of government in the room. It becomes a part of the culture. And now I'm beginning to see that sometimes that public service worker or the politician, sometimes it is the man. And he is still using that lens to get things right because it has become a part of the culture of government. I am certain that it's true at the federal level just from listening to Dr. Leach. It's becoming true at the other orders of government as well. While the percentage is small, we're having a huge impact, and that can only grow. But what it means is I have to be a good daughter. I have to remember what my mother said to me when I said, I know I've got small kids, but I'm going to need your help because I'm going to run for government and I'm going to be busy. I used to do her Ruth's job, and she said, well, you'll never be home. And I said, that's why I'm saying I'll need your help. And she said, I'll do this. Your dad and I will help you with the girls, but make it count. Make it count. Make a real difference. And I think that just being one of many women means that I have made that difference in government. But I think we all have to do that in whatever walk of life. If we're really going to be good daughters to our moms, both now while we're sitting next to them and into the future, when we become the mom, we are going to make that difference. We put that special lens on things that allows us to really fully realize things that are possible in a society like Canada. And so we must continue to do it, to be good daughters, and to push our daughters to do the same. I'm happy to do that in government, and I know that all of you are in the work you do with the ARS, but also the work that you do throughout your lifetime. And I thank you for it. Thank you.
Unfortunately, the Provincial Minister of Women's Issues, Minister Teresa Peruzza, could not be here with us today. However, she has sent greetings, which I will now read to you. I'd like to extend warm greetings to everyone attending today's International Women's Day celebration. This is a wonderful opportunity for women to network and promote our collective accomplishments. As we reflect on our social, economic, and political achievements, it is fitting that we are marking the 30th anniversary of the Ontario Women's Directorate this year. While women have experienced much successes over the past 30 years, there is still work to be done to achieve full equality. Our government wants women to be active contributors in the workforce and have opportunities to advance. That is why we are proud of our efforts to promote women in corporate leadership. We're committed to broader gender diversity on the boards and in senior management of major businesses, non-for-profits, and other organizations. And we continue to work with our partners to advance women's leadership at all levels. Strong women mean a strong Ontario. As Minister responsible for women's issues, I am dedicated to ensuring that all women and girls in our province have the opportunity to reach their full potential and contribute to Ontario's economic prosperity. Thank you to the Armenian Relief Society, Roubina chapter of Toronto, for organizing today's celebration. Please accept my best wishes for a successful and meaningful day. Yours truly, Teresa Peruzza, Ontario Minister responsible for women's issues. At this time, I'm going to hand the microphone over to my fellow journalist, Mary Nersesian Sagarian. Pembidi Haravirem, Mary Nersesian Sagariana. Thank you.
Ajam hajui kunim sezi nergayatsnelu merai sorva donagadarutian panachos Ani Demirjiana. I now have the pleasure to introduce to you our guest speaker for this afternoon, Ms. Ani Demirjian. Before we call her to the stage, I'd like to read her bio to you. Ani Demirjian is the practice leader of democratic governance at the United Nations Development Program. She has 30 years of executive experience working for the federal government of Canada and for the United Nations Development Program. Her areas of specialization include transitional governance and multilateral norms, public sector reform, public accountability, and oversight and institutional development. In 2004, soon after the Iraq War, Ms. Demirjian was seconded from the federal government to UNDP to serve as the head of the Democratic Governance Cluster for UN-UNDP system. In Iraq, she was responsible for the constitutional drafting, the elections, institutional reform, and community mediation programs. In 2008, she was appointed to head the governance portfolio at UNDP Somalia, where she was responsible for the constitutional and institutional reform programs. Since 2009, Ms. Demirjian has been the practice leader for the Democratic Governance Program for Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. Within the UN, as a recognized expert in transitional governance in conflict and post-conflict countries, she is often called upon to serve in troubled spots. In 2010, she served in Haiti after the devastating earthquake and led the UNDP World Bank Needs Assessment exercise. In 2011-2012, in Libya after the fall of Gaddafi, she served for 1 year as Senior Governance and Public Administration Reform Advisor to the Special Representative of the Secretary General. In these assignments, she worked closely with prime ministers and their deputies. Since 2009, Ms. Demirjian has conducted several missions to Armenia. Most recently, working with UNDP Armenia, she led high-level discussions with the government of Armenia on public accountability, transparency, and public administration reform. Apart from being passionate about democratic governance and development issues, Ms. Demirjian is an educator and a supporter of youth initiatives. In her capacity, she has been invited to lecture at universities in Kazakhstan, Hungary, and Armenia. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Ani Demirjian.
Wow. This is some event, some introduction, and let me first wish you all a happy International Women's Day. I must say I'm truly honored to be back here in Toronto, where I did grow up, and I did leave at one point, but my heart was always in Toronto, and with ARS, I must say, as well. This is an organization that has shaped many of us, our training, our cultural background, and I'm sure our leadership capacity, we owe it to you ladies. So I'm, I guess, one of the products of your work. Indeed, honorable guests, I'm also delighted to hear that Toronto, you had a fairly warm winter recently. Where I was coming from, and I must add to the introduction that was very generous, that I left Bratislava since, and I moved back to Mogadishu, Somalia, where I'm presently heading the Secretary General's Political Affairs and the Constitutional Team. So I'm back to sunny spots, but I'm delighted to be here indeed. First of all, let me thank the organizers of this grand event. Absolutely a grand event. I'm sure there are hundreds of ladies behind this organization, hundreds. But there are 3 individuals I do need to thank and recognize their work, because of them that I'm indeed present today. First of all, let me thank Varsenik Sarkisyan and Lena Ohannesyan, who invited me. But I have a very special thanks to Maral Hasırjian, who did her research, and how on earth she found me, it is quite interesting. She found me through Yerevan, Armenia, back chasing me in Bratislava, if I may say, and she was consistently supporting me to make sure that indeed I was participating at this event. Maral, Varskut Gadarjan. Thank you. The earlier speakers honored Women's Day, and they did justice. Fortunately for me, the organizers of today's event, they asked me to talk about humanitarian aid and journalism, and the impact, of course, on Armenia and Armenian communities, specifically coming back to Toronto. In my presentation, next 25 minutes, I'm going to meander about humanitarian aid, about humanitarian organizations, journalism and the role of journalism in humanitarian aid. I'm going to meander, of course, to Armenia as well, and some of the challenges that you ladies face in terms of doing work in Armenia, and some of the challenges, and I think the Honorable Member of Parliament mentioned in terms of the work you're doing in Syria, humanitarian aid and the role of media again. And we're going to come back to Toronto. So forgive me. When I was first asked to comment on humanitarian aid and journalism, to be honest, I felt I'm not a humanitarian expert. And in reflection on the Home's, Armenian Relief Society's efforts of the past 100 years, and in the case of Toronto, last 50 years, I don't think I qualify to comment about humanitarian aid. If anything, every single woman, I'm sure, in this room who has been active in ARS, you can write the book on humanitarian organizations. Not only you can write a book on humanitarian aid, but you can write a book on how to be an effective and efficient humanitarian aid organization. So my next, as I meander, I felt I need to define what is a good humanitarian aid organization, and I didn't have to look very far. So if you forgive me, while the MC has introduced the history of ARS, let me comment again in terms of my brief research that I did, how the humanitarian aid organization was established in 1910. And many Armenians and all of us, including our guests, know these were crucial period in the history of Armenia, 1910 heading towards 1915. And I say this is a very unique organization in the history of Armenia. Simply the role that they have played last 100 years is indeed unique in any humanitarian aid, that whether we are defining it from the international perspective, UN perspective, ARS remains unique. Historically, when they were formed, one of the key roles they played, as it was mentioned by earlier speakers, right after the Armenian genocide, the role of ARS was to locate Armenian children all over, including the Derzors of Syria, opening, managing orphanages and schools, finding houses, replacing the displaced persons, not only throughout the Middle East, but of course globally. And this is an important building block for a humanitarian organization that ARS has played an incredible role. In decades after the genocide, ARS' sole occupation was humanitarian aid and to support, of course, the distressed Armenian communities around the world. And, as I said, eventually ARS defined what does it mean to be, within the context of UN, what does it mean to be a good humanitarian aid organization. In the case of Toronto, of course, I'm happy to hear that Toronto is affiliated, and earlier I mentioned you guys, ladies, can indeed write a book. And today you serve the children of this community, Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and abroad. Indeed, you represent in the 20th and the 21st century the true spirit of humanitarian aid organization. And I think some of the speakers mentioned the enormous work you have done historically, and I will comment on that one in Armenia, and Syria was mentioned as well. But let me continue the efforts in other places that you have supported. Artsakh, Lebanon, Egypt, and the list goes on. And that goes also for the home ARS here in Toronto. In the 70s, as ARS evolved, it was mentioned, ARS became a member of the UN agencies, and in 1998 became a member of the ECOSOC, Economic and Social Council. And I have to say, I met the member of the ARS in UN, and they remain a very active member indeed. In 1914, I recognized that home Roubina chapter is celebrating its 51st anniversary. Happy anniversary, ladies. On this International Women's Day, we do celebrate the achievements of ARS and thank the women volunteers of the Armenian communities for being the torchbearers for the revival, renaissance of our communities through their tireless humanitarian work. On this occasion, let me just say, I say chapeau and congratulations, and on this International Women's Day, Roubina chapter, bravo and job well done. I'm going to make a connection between the humanitarian work of ARS, and journalism. And this is again an area that ARS has been a pioneer. And when I recall the history, you will remember. In 1988, we in Armenia had one of the most devastating earthquakes. And I think it was behind the Soviet Union, but it was the first historical event where the international aid communities, humanitarian organizations led by ARS, and the international global media came to reflect on the challenges post-Armenian earthquake during and after. And I have to say, the role of ARS during the Armenian earthquake was tremendous, and how they worked with the international and the local media. I remember at the time, I was serving with the federal government in Ottawa, and the community around ARS galvanized the humanitarian support with the support of the international media, with the support of the Canadian media, and got the word out on the disaster in the Armenian communities in Armenia, and of course surrounding communities. And this is where perhaps it was a historical trigger point where the ARS maybe came historically recognized the role that the international media or the media plays. And it was a kind of a takeoff point. And then the challenges and the work with the international media or the national media followed for ARS from there. It wasn't just an example for ARS Canada, but actually the 1988 earthquake was a turning point for international aid organizations, international humanitarian organizations, and how the media came together. In terms of the support, of course, the Armenian community ARS that led at the time in 1988, I think it was throughout North America. And as I said, their challenges and the work that they led, it was Herculean. And I think to date, Armenian communities in Armenia owe it to ARS for the support they provided, they have been providing since 1988. One of the other nice things about the ARS in terms of their humanitarian work they do, apart from supporting schools, public outreach, hospitals, supporting communities, supporting youth groups, of course, is the public outreach and the fundraising. And I was extremely impressed the way they use the new media. And especially I arrived a few days ago, and to see that on our TV screen in the Armenian program, ARS has been doing the telethon here in Toronto, and they've been able to raise $350,000 just in 2 weeks, in 2 weekends. I think this organization, as a unique and a model humanitarian aid organization, has also been effective again recently during the American Thanksgiving Telethon, where they collected, the community in large, collected $22 million over 24 hours. $22 million, colleagues. This is the Armenian community globally. I just want to give you one little comparison. 6 months ago, there was a tragedy in Russia, and we were involved, as I was based in Bratislava. I was involved in that tragedy. They did a telethon. It was a Russia-wide telethon. In 24 hours, they were able to collect $180,000. So, just a point to remember. Let me now come back and make the connection between the second part of my presentation, the link between humanitarian aid and journalism. And let me provide my international perspective. Right at the outset, let me say that I describe the link between humanitarian organization and journalism, or the role of the media, as the two sides of the same coin. One needs the other, and the other media needs the humanitarian aid organizations, and the humanitarian aid organizations need the media for sustainability and survival. There's a different approach during disasters, different approach during conflict, post-conflict, where you need the international national media, where you need journalists to work with you as humanitarian organizations. And there's a separate need, almost a separate skill set, where ARS and other international national humanitarian organizations need to change hats, use a different skill set to join hands with media and the journalism. And I'm going to describe to you these two differences, because in some areas, ARS and other homegrown humanitarian organizations are very good at. We were extremely good at in 1988. But as the 21st century, as humanitarian aid becomes more complex, as we compete more with the Philippine typhoons, with the Haiti earthquake, with the Rwandan genocide, with the Ethiopian famine, as the world is becoming more complex and our attention as citizens of Canada, or volunteers of humanitarian organizations, how effective are we going to be during disaster, during conflict, or post-conflict, where we are comfortably at home here in Toronto? Is it the same skill set do we need? Or is this the skill set that we do have, is it sufficient for today's or tomorrow's support that you need to do, be in the Syrian community in Aleppo, or in Artsakh, or in Armenia, or here for the homeless in Toronto? There are different sets and there are different developments globally that I would like to share with you. As the young lady who introduced me, I went to Haiti right after the earthquake, which perhaps was one of the biggest disaster in my lifetime, at least, that required such a huge humanitarian, international, national effort to tackle something even the United Nations or international communities, we couldn't handle it. And I think at the end, we had to admit that international organizations, humanitarian organizations, were unable to handle the Haiti challenge. That was perhaps, I would say, the worst. But where was the link with the media or with the journalists? This is the reality, colleagues, out there in the field when you're working on humanitarian work. And I'm going to say even here in Toronto. But this is what happens. The challenge happens, disaster takes place, Philippines, Haiti, Armenian earthquake, international media, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, CBC, descend. They descend immediately. We call this in the international community a CNN moment. This is where the humanitarian organizations have a huge challenge. Because humanitarian organizations, such as ARS, were on the ground in Armenia immediately. They're on the ground in Syria immediately to help the needy, to help the communities, to help the injured, and the list goes on. But the international community, whether it is Christian Amanpour, Peter Mansbridge, or Anderson Cooper from CNN, when they arrive, they are there for the immediate, to record the disaster, to communicate back home to the Canadians or to the globe. They have 2-3 days. They need quick information, quick data, immediate recovery solutions, and they go back home. And guess what? Humanitarian organizations, including ARS or many other Canadian humanitarian organizations that I have worked with in the past 30 years in my life, they end up holding the bag of dealing with the real-life tragedies that is left behind when the CNN and the BBC and the CBC and the Mansbridge go back home. So at the end of the day, while you do work very closely with the media, with the journalists, because you want to get your news out, you want to get your information out, you want to get your fundraising out, you want to make sure you reach out to your 50,000 Armenian plus members here in Canada to do the fundraising so you can support the needy in the field. In terms of the humanitarian aid workers and the role of the journalists, I would say it's a love-hate relationship. While one needs the other, and you need them, you need to work with them. But there are pluses and minuses. And I think some of the challenges that our smaller humanitarian organizations have, such as ARS, is that do you have the capacity, do you have the expertise? And I'm absolutely delighted to see young Armenian journalists now among you who are working with you, with ARS on this subject, which meaning recognizing that you do need to develop the capacity, expertise to get your word out, to get your history out, and to control your narrative. Otherwise, the larger global outlets, the journalists who would be coming in quickly and going out, will be telling their narrative, and it might not necessarily be your narrative that you want to tell them. So I'm very pleased to see, for a small, you remain in the global context, ARS remains a small organization, but powerful one, that you are teaming up with journalists, that you're teaming up with Armenian journalists, and you're training them. This is indeed, as an older generation, I'm going to say, this is indeed truly a very positive sign, and I'm very happy to see that. In terms of, though, I think for smaller organizations, again, making the link between humanitarian organizations and journalists or the media, be national and global, I would say there are whole new developments and something that works towards smaller humanitarian organizations such as ARS. And I will come back to that one. And I would, let me just say why the 21st century, the new technology, the new tools are going to work for you. But you need to make sure you are connected, because the old media, the traditional media, as I said, the way I described to you, they will descend, they will take the 2-3 day coverage, they will be coming back home. But how do you continue? How do you sustain your relationship with the media? How do you sustain your work? And how do you continue to get the work out to your community for public outreach, fundraising, or organizing events as such? I would say the last 5-10 years, at least within the UN context, we have seen a huge trend in terms of moving away from the traditional media, from the traditional journalists, and moving into more towards the new social networks or the new media. And I have to say, on this, in the new media, the Armenian communities from California to Canada to Europe to Middle East to Armenia, especially the younger generation, are extremely good at using the new media. The difference between the new media and the traditional media when you are working in humanitarian aid is the following. It's very simple, which I'm sure many of you have discovered here in the room. Traditional media, BBC, CBC, Al Jazeera, they have their agenda. You don't control their agenda. You may give your narrative on the floor. You may give your data on the recovery plan on the ground when you're serving the communities, but you don't control the narrative. With the new media, on the other hand, you control your narrative. And this is the most wonderful thing. You go over the heads of Peter Mansbridge and Christian Amanpour, and I'm going to say even the UN, such as me. You need to go over us and reach out to the communities where actually you control the narrative, where you reach out, and in terms of public outreach and fundraising, it's an absolutely phenomenal experience. To connect with some of the, while you, again, I say with some of the small humanitarian organizations are using it, and using it most effectively. So while you need to team up with the journalists, but you need to also start using the new media to control the narrative for your fundraising and for your public outreach, and to develop the new skill set. This is indeed a very powerful phenomenon, and in reflection for today's event, I felt if there's one message I need to highlight, it's the role of the new media in humanitarian aid. Unlike, of course, smaller organizations, and I will come to some suggestions, recommendations, for the smaller NGOs going directly to the citizens, you kind of cut the middle person. And that has been, of course, has been effective. Perhaps ARS is already doing that one, but again, in my absence here in Toronto, perhaps I wasn't quite versed as to how advanced you were in the use of new media. One of the challenges humanitarian organizations have, apart from, of course, bypassing the traditional journalists and the traditional media and working with the new media, with the new tools, and that is, of course, it's what happens when the news dies down, when the CNN moment disappears. How do you make your humanitarian work more sustainable? How do you remain effective in a vast, complex world where everybody's attention is diverted? Tragedies, of course, the world communications brings to you, the global media brings to you the disasters right into your living room on hourly, minutely basis. One of the other challenges you do face as a humanitarian organization, post-financial crisis. Almost all societies, without exception, and perhaps in the West, it has even been worse. Perhaps Canada wasn't affected by the international crisis, financial crisis, I would say, than Europe, US, or definitely in Asia and Eastern Europe for sure. I think you are competing for financial, at least for fundraising, with the rest of the disasters. Hence, this remains a challenge for you. But my good Armenian grandmother used to say the following: Armenians are like an empty bag of flour. The more you shake it, the more money will come. So we don't have to worry too much about the Armenian community because we will be shaking. In Armenian, I think my grandmother used to say, Մենք ալուրի դոբրագի բեսենք, գտատվենք եւ տրամգինա. I commented about the new tools that are needed for fundraising, but in this complex, indeed, as the humanitarian organizations are becoming more complex, as the media, new media is becoming more complex, I have a couple of suggestions for you as you move forward into the next phase, into the next century, into the next phase. One, my recommendation would be the larger organizations such as International Red Cross, World Vision, Care Canada. The larger humanitarian organizations are definitely better equipped, more connected through the networks, more connected internationally. And in this very vast field where there's huge competition for the narrative, the fundraising, and getting the stories out, my recommendation to ARS is, especially in this very mature Canadian Toronto society, unlike perhaps in places where I work, my recommendation would be that you truly team up in terms of the new direction, the new skill set that you do need, the new tools you need to develop with other Canadian institutions, as I said, that are connected internationally and have more, sometimes they have more up-to-date information. They definitely have more funds. I'm sure the federal government does help. And of course, they have broader channels as well. And I think case in point is the example of Syria. Any work that we are doing, any work that ARS is doing in Syria, my recommendation is that you do team up with other Canadian international networks to make sure that your resources, your efforts are reaching the Armenian and other communities in Syria. The second, of course, my recommendation would be that humanitarian work is becoming very complex and very specialized. Therefore, new resources and new tools are needed, and actually connecting with the UN. While you have a representative in the UN, I just don't think enough work has been done with UNHCR and the ARS. I strongly recommend that the Toronto chapter connects with the UN as well. I made a recommendation that traditional journalists, while you will continue to use, it is strongly recommended that the new social media that is better connected with the UN, it's also explored and used. And I have to say, in terms of fundraising, I think many humanitarian organizations will say that it is becoming even more effective tool. Finally, let me say that one of the challenge, even Canadian context, ARS and all of us have, humanitarian organizations, and specifically, let me take this one back to Armenia. Humanitarian organizations come in, tackle the immediate conflict, post-disaster problems, dealing with recovery issues, dealing with livelihood issues, etc. But what happens when the humanitarian work stops? Where do you go next? And I have to say, within the Canadian context, within ARS, sometimes we have given very little thought what happens when the humanitarian organizations, humanitarian workers go home. What happens to these communities? And this is something where both the traditional media and the humanitarian organizations have failed or have done poorly. Case in point in Armenia. How many of you have heard that since 1988, do we know, or how do we know what has happened to the earthquake victims of Armenia? Have we caught up to that? Have we sent Peter Mansbridge to do a program on what has happened to the victims of Armenia in 1988? Or have we covered recently we have maybe heard follow-ups on the Haiti. Or have we done any follow-ups on the Rwandan genocide? Have we done any follow-ups on the famine in Ethiopia? And again, as I said, list goes on. Recently, we have been covering, you've been inundated on the Philippines typhoon. And I know there are some still, CBC does some follow-ups. But what happens when CBC goes home? What happens to you? What do you do? What is the link between humanitarian work and real sustainable communities that you serve, that we all have to serve? What happens to that? This is a huge gap, not only of course, within the Canadian context, ARS, but this is also a huge gap within the international context, and I'm even going to say within the United Nations as well. Fortunately for us, in the international community, we have international development organizations. And some humanitarian organizations have been fortunate or have been proactive to link with development communities. And the reason I gave the example as Armenia, simply because after the fall of the Soviet Union, ARS came in, worked, humanitarian organizations worked in Armenia, some continue to work in Artsakh. But when the humanitarian organizations did leave, or are leaving, what happens to these developed communities? Where there remains huge development challenges. I think I don't have to tell this community the poverty situation in Armenia, specifically when it comes to Armenian women, is absolutely dismal. And I have been working, as it was mentioned, Armenian communities do have many challenges. Post-Soviet, poor infrastructure, poor governance, high corruption, high migration, poor election results, and the list goes on. Not to mention poor or very nascent private sector development. This is to say, while internationally Armenia moved into a middle-income country, very quickly Armenia fell back into a poor country, and presently it is considered a very poor country. Why? Humanitarian work was conducted last 20 years, and many humanitarian workers left and went home. And the gap from humanitarian to development was not a natural transition. And right now, the country faces huge challenges. My recommendation to you would be, I'm not here to say you should switch your skill set from humanitarian aid to development organization. No. But what I do say, within the context of our communities, within the context of Canada, be CEDA or elsewhere, there is a gap that humanitarian organizations leave, including the media, that doesn't make that smooth transition from humanitarian work to development work, to make sure the communities you are serving remain sustainable. And at the end of the day, if it's our effort to help, to serve the communities, to serve the women, to serve the girls. And I'm very happy to hear that we are initiating International Girls' Day. And I think that something should be supported. But if we are to continue that smooth line between the humanitarian disaster work to development work, this gap has to be addressed. I'm going to challenge you for your next conference, indeed, to make sure that you explore the opportunities with Canadian resources, with Canadian institutions that we do have, that this gap is addressed, whether you're looking at it from the humanitarian perspective or you're looking at it from the humanitarian and the media perspective. The gap has to be filled. One of the challenges I did say in terms of the Armenia, when I say the poverty rate is very high, and many international organizations, and with all due respect, including the Canadian government, feel they don't need to give humanitarian or development aid to Armenia anymore because Armenia has already reached middle-income country. No, I think we are doing ourselves as an organization, as a country, injustice, and it's unfair to the communities we are to serve. The minute you step outside Yerevan, not only in Yerevan, that is true in Georgia, in Azerbaijan, in many of the former Soviet Union countries, you step outside the big cities, the rural areas need desperate, and I mean desperate, humanitarian aid, which many of them, by the way, in the case of Armenia, live under less than $2 a day. $2 a day. This is all throughout the rural communities in Armenia. I'm almost going to conclude. But I think the organizers will remind me when I need to stop. Having said that, while on the International Women's Day, we celebrate the achievements of humanitarian organizations and the role of the journalists, the role of the media, or the new media plays. But I think we need to say that there are quite few challenges that remain ahead. And I think we need to be mindful that the challenges ahead, when we partner with the appropriate organizations, these challenges remain diminished. Perhaps I can conclude with 4 recommendations here. As ARS moves into the next decade, and in order to continue your vibrant legacy, which you already have, I think we need to recognize today, on this very special International Women's Day, that the complexities of humanitarian work and building partnership with other like-minded institutions, it is absolutely paramount. And I think in the case of Toronto, Roubina chapter, you have all the talent, all the resources, all the wonderful institutions right here in Canada and in Toronto. And I think the representatives earlier, they already made mention of those institutions that you need to team up with. Second, I think we need to recognize that the role of the new media and the new networks can better serve the humanitarian aid and the humanitarian organizations of today. The old journalism served our need of yesterday. But as you look forward, you need to look at the new channels as well as the new tools and the new skill set. In terms of faster dissemination of information, better fundraising, and building better new resources and better networks, and of course, to do a better public outreach within the Armenian and other communities. My third recommendation would be, as humanitarian organization, as you team up with the new media, you need to reflect. At one point, humanitarian aid, humanitarian work will be diminished where the development work must begin. Perhaps not so in the case of course, the communities you're serving. Absolutely not in Toronto. But as you are serving communities outside in Armenia, Artsakh, or Syria, I think you need to recognize that development work, especially when you're working in Armenia and Artsakh, you need to find a way to link between the humanitarian work and the development work, specifically when it comes to the rural communities, and underlining, of course, the support to the Armenian, the young girls, young boys and girls, if I may say. Finally, I was given an opportunity, and earlier when I walked into the room, I ran into a wonderful lady who knew my former boss from Ottawa. And I wanted to send her a former minister, a federal minister. I'm not going to embarrass him now. A former minister who gave me my first opportunity to work at the Privy Council office in Canada. And I wanted to say, if I'm here today, I really owe it to my community, my Armenian community here in Toronto, ARS and all the supporters. Many of the ladies who came and saw me, they recognized me 35 years ago. I owe it to them, but I also owe it to the Canadian government that gave me the opportunity, one specific minister. I'm here today in the United Nations because I owe it to many women and men who have helped me get where I am. My recommendation would be, I think it behooves on the community to, especially for the next generation that are taking the helm, they're leading the torch, which I am seeing very well. Why not join international humanitarian organizations as well? And I can assure you, maybe we have the job opportunity difficulties of unemployment, but there are umpteen jobs that in the international humanitarian organizations, there is lots of room for good Canadian talent. So I would definitely say, why not make UNHCR and the UN or international organizations a choice of employment opportunity, as well as, of course, I would say, do join the new international media as well, but of course I don't need to worry about that component perhaps as much, simply because the younger generation are more with it than I am. Finally, while on this International Women's Day we celebrate the achievements of Armenian women, ARS, more specifically the ladies, the volunteers in this room, much work remains ahead. I believe ARS has already proven to be a powerhouse as an effective and efficient organization, and I'm convinced, I am sure, that going forward with the new tools, new skills, and the new talent among you, you will be conquering the challenges of the years ahead that will be ahead of you. I wish you a very happy International Women's Day, and I would like to make sure that this community continues to support, which they do need all the support, the ARS chapter of Roubina, Toronto. Thank you.